Representative or Vice Chair Ortiz.
I'm here.
Co-Chair Johnston. And my understanding is she's trying to call in right now, so we'll come back to her as well.
Bear with me as I get this set up.
Leonard.
Hi, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, great to have you on. Representative Sullivan Leonard, Representative Josephson.
I'm here.
Representative Wool.
Counted for.
Representative Merrick.
I'm here.
And myself, Co-Chair Foster. We'll come back. Representative Tilton, are you there? And Representative Carpenter. Okay, great. Well, we have a quorum here. And today the committee will hear two presentations. The first will be from Larry Persily on the challenges the legislature will face this upcoming session. And the second will be the Legislative Finance Division presenting an overview of the governor's proposed budget. Oh, we've got Representative Dunleavy Johnson in the audience here. And purpose of this meeting is to take a high-level look at the governor's budget. This is an opportunity for legislators to ask questions, and it will give legislative finance ample time to research and get back to us before the start of session. So both presentations today can be accessed by going to akleg.gov. Again, that's akleg.gov. And from there, you can select the Meetings tab, and then you just select the Documents link that is next to the House Finance meeting. And so one more time, again, online, you can go to akleg.gov, select the Meetings tab, and then click on the Documents link next to the House Finance Committee meeting. I'd also like to note that we have Representative Harriet Drummond also online. Thanks for joining us. And since this meeting is teleconferenced, it might be cleaner if everyone could just hold off on asking questions until the end. And so with that, if we could go to our first presenter, it's Larry Persily. Mr. Persily, if you could put yourself on the record and begin your testimony or your presentation. We do have Mr. Brody Anderson who will advance the slides for you, if you could just let him know when. And so with that, Mr. Persily.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members, other legislators. My name is Larry Persily. I'm currently living in Anchorage, and I guess I'm speaking today as a former state deputy commissioner, Department of Revenue, and I've had other municipal finance posts in Kenai and Anchorage. And talk today to explain, as the chairman said, the context of the governor's budget proposal that's going to be before you when you convene in a couple weeks. And as I thought about it, read through the budget submission, did some research, it really came down to me, there's two questions before legislators as you get together this year, and they both just deal with time and money. Does the state have enough time to wait for enough money to appear so we have a sustainable, balanced fiscal plan? And where will that money come from? So that's one question. The other is, do we have enough money to last until time catches up? This presentation isn't to criticize or pick sides. It's just to explain in realistic terms for staff, for legislators, for the public, kind of where Alaska is. And this is a big year. This really is going to be a tough year for legislators. Next slide.
And Mr. Persily, I'm sorry, I just wanted to note the other legislators who are also online here. We also have our other finance member, Representative Jennifer Johnston's online. Representative Speaker Edgman is online. Representative Clayman is also online. And I believe I have everyone. So I'm sorry for that. Mr. Persily?
Oh, that's okay. You're the chairman. You get to interrupt me all the time.
We just wanted to make sure they're shown as being here from the very beginning. So thank you, Mr. Persily.
Thank you. So, Brody, if we could go to the next slide where it's titled Time is Short, as is Money. I'd like to explain what's in the permanent fund earnings reserve. There's been a lot of talk about it, and what I can tell you is the balance sheet that's on the permanent fund website as of November 30th shows $9.45 billion in what they're calling uncommitted and available in the earnings reserve. Now, one thing to remember about that is that 9.45 isn't all in the bank. About 7.1 billion is what's called realized. It's where they sold the investments. It's real money. It's profit they've taken. So of that 9.45, 7.1 billion is realized. The other 2.3 billion and change is what's called unrealized. It was profits on the books as of November 30. Doesn't mean it's going to be profits on the book the next day or the next week or the next month. It's unrealized gains that hopefully will turn into realized gains when they sell the investments or get their payments, but you don't know. Now, that 9.45 billion that's referred to as uncommitted on their balance sheet, that reflects the percent of market value draw for the current fiscal year, FY21. It also accounts for the anticipated fiscal year 2022 5% draw, percent of market value, which is currently estimated at 3.069 billion. They do it that way because clearly that money, well, I guess as clear as anything can be in the world these days, is going to be drawn in FY22, and as they manage the fund, as far as the balance sheet goes, that's already committed in their mind. So that's where you get the 9.45 billion as of November 30. The governor, in his budget proposal to the legislature and the public, is proposing an additional $1.2 billion draw from the earnings of the permanent fund in spring of 2021 to pay an additional dividend to Alaskans of about $1,900. He's then also proposing an additional roughly $2 billion draw after July 1 from FY22, which would have to be approved by the legislature in calendar 21, so that the state could pay the so-called full dividend of $3,000 in the fall. So he's looking for an additional $3.2 billion in the calendar year, spread over a couple fiscal years, to pay out close to an additional $5,000 in dividends. The governor has been talking to Alaskans about how the permanent fund has gained more than $10 billion March through November 30, and that's correct, but it's really not the whole story. Yes, the permanent fund gained $10 billion, April 1 to November 30, but that's after it lost more than $7 billion in the first 3 months of the year. So that's kind of like saying to your partner, gee, I did great in Vegas. I made $100,000, but not mentioning you sort of lost 75 before you made the 100. So yes, the permanent fund net is up, but was up in calendar 2020, but not $10 billion from where it started at the start of the year. And as we all know from investment earnings, and this is nothing against the permanent fund, those are numbers as of that balance sheet. You don't know what they're going to be tomorrow. Which then takes us to the next slide.
And if I could just recognize Representative Sharon Jackson has also been online from the very start as well. Thank you for joining us, Representative Jackson. Mr. Persily?
Sure. So the next slide, the question is, will the savings last? You know, if you can craft the numbers and think of it in many different ways, but if you just want to say, okay, if I take the 5% of market value draw for FY21, which you've already appropriated, do the same for FY22, which will be before you this session, and the additional draw of $3+ billion for the additional dividends in the spring and the larger dividend in the fall, that's more than $9 billion. Add all that up, and that's roughly 13% of the total balance of the permanent fund on November 30th, 2020. Not their earnings reserve, again, I'm looking, they're about 13% of the total fund. As we know, you can't spend what's in the principal, but just to give you some perspective. In the permanent fund, Board of Trustees has consistently over the years talked about maintaining a solid balance in the earnings reserve, because that's where we're paying for public services and dividends, and there's volatility in the earnings. We know that. So they have recommended, if you're going to continue with the 5% withdrawal, percent of market value, prudent advice is keep 4 times the annual draw there. So that's about $12 billion to guard against going there someday in a down market year and the money's not there. So that's their advice, and they, I guess that's in the context of back in fiscal year 09 during the economic meltdown, the permanent fund lost $6 billion, and that's always the worry. What if we rely on the earnings? What if there's the decision to maybe overdraw the earnings for good reason at the moment, but then the country, the investments hit a really bad year like we did in FY09, you drop $6 billion of value, all of a sudden now things are really close and worrisome. Alaska has been using fund earnings through the percent of market value since fiscal year 19 after having relied on the constitutional budget reserve for more than half of the 30 years since it was created to help balance spending. The deficit's not new. The fund, as we're told, is going to be $600 million, maybe a little more at the end of this current fiscal year. So that constitutional budget reserve is really not on the table anymore for wholesale help to the budget. We're relying on the earnings reserve in the permanent fund. So if we could go next slide, longer term.
And if I could just recognize that Representative Tilton, our other finance member, has also joined us earlier as well. Thank you for being here today, Representative Tilton. Mr. Persily?
Sure. So getting back to the questions, as we know, we've run through the constitutional budget reserve. The legislature and governors have not paid that so-called full dividend under the 1982 formula since 2015. The money just wasn't there. So the legislature and governors since 2015, starting the next year, have looked at the available funds, looked at the needs, and come up with an amount that they felt was an affordable dividend. That's kind of the world we're in, but that formula from 1982 is still on the books. If calculated under that formula, you're at a very large dividend, 3,000 plus. So the governor has proposed that there be a special election this spring on an advisory question, which would ask Alaskans, and his proposal is a 50-50 split between dividends and the budget that pays for public services. Taking this allocation question to voters, in an advisory vote, there's always that risk. What if they say no? And then kind of on an aside, if the legislature didn't have to debate the dividend every year, sessions would really go short. But I don't know if that's an optimistic view or just an unfortunate fact of it has been a major political issue in recent years, obviously. So the governor's proposing spring special election on a dividend formula. He's also proposing 3 constitutional amendments. And under the law, they can only go on the general election ballot, so they would come in November of 2022. One would be to turn the permanent fund into a true endowment, and this is something the trustees have recommended and talked about, where you no longer would have this line between principal and earnings, and you can only spend the earnings. You would just treat the whole kitty as an endowment, continue setting the maximum withdrawal. Currently in statute, it's 5%. The notion being that, say, you take out 5% a year, but long term, the fund expects to earn 6.75. You can withdraw your 5% and still grow the fund over time. Some years, sure, it's going to earn less than 6.75. It may earn less than 5. It may lose money. There are other years it will earn more. So if you stick with that, you don't need to worry about the line between principals and earnings. It will continue to grow. The other constitutional amendment the governor would like is a spending limit, something that's been talked about certainly for years. And he hasn't had any details on this, but a constitutional amendment, a prohibition on any new taxes without a vote of the public. And that poses some calendar challenges as we'll go ahead. So on the next slide, all of this discussion and all the issues before you deal with matching spending and revenues, in addition to taking extra money out of the permanent fund to pay dividends, talking about constitutional amendments. The governor's 10-year budget plan and this year's budget proposes an additional 10%, $450 million in budget cuts over the next 3 years. And certainly the crux of the debate before the public is you've got limited funds and how you're going to split them up between services, dividends, how to pay for it all. The governor, in his budget proposal, does say that Alaska's economy will rebound from the pandemic as soon as fiscal year 2023, and it may be healthy enough to bear additional revenue measures, but no specifics, no information on what those additional revenues measures would be. Certainly sounds like new taxes. His 10-year budget plan counts on $1.2 billion in fiscal 23 in other revenue sources without specifying those, and then about $1 billion every year after that. So as the legislature looked at this year, even though it's calendar 21 and you're working on the FY22 budget, you've got a $1.2 billion hole in 23 that supposedly will be filled by other revenue sources. If you're going to have other revenue sources in FY23, you got to start working on them soon. And this is not to advocate sales tax, advocate income tax, but any kind of new broad-based statewide tax takes a lot of time to set up for government, for employers, for businesses, whoever's going to do the collection. So thinking you're going to have a full year of new revenue in FY23, which starts July 1, 2022, which is less than 18 months from now, that's a speculative, speculative number, and whether you can put it together that soon. I mean, it's sort of ironic after you think about it, if you've got this big budget hole of other revenues, and if you have a constitutional prohibition on no new taxes without a vote of the public, it's ironic that after Alaskans voted not to change oil taxes in November, about the only thing you could do with a flip of the switch would be to raise oil taxes. And this is not advocating for that, it's just pointing out so the box we put ourselves in. On the next slide, the governor, certainly, as all Alaskans are aware, this hasn't been 2020 was not a great year for the Alaska economy with COVID lockdowns, low fishing prices, low oil prices, and out-migration of residents. The governor's budget, the governor's proposing a statewide bond issue, general obligation bond issue that would have to go to a vote of the public, $300 to $350 million of the proverbial shovel-ready projects, no specifics, but he talks about roads to resources, renewable energy, ports, harbors, runways, the usual list we see on these. It would require a vote of the public. He's proposing to do that in the spring so that so that Alaskans can go to work and start working on these soon, but it would require a vote because it is a general obligation bond. The challenge, as legislators know, is putting together a list that will get enough votes that doesn't get too large, and is the Alaska public willing to vote to take on additional debt at this point? So that brings us to the calendar, and that's the next slide, and it may be a little fuzzy. I will admit I have some skills. Graphics is just not one of my big skills. So hopefully this is readable. But I just kind of wanted to lay out the calendar that you've got the choices before you. 2021 session, you've got to decide, are you going to have a special election on the bond issue, on the dividend advisory vote? Are you going to exceed the 5% permanent fund draw to pay for public services or to pay for dividends, and how much for dividends? Then we could end up with a special election in the spring. The July 1, new fiscal year, you're going to have a draw on the permanent fund. The question is, how much is in the earnings reserve? How much are you going to draw? Probably, if you want a dividend, you're going to have to exceed the 5%. There's just no other way to make the math work. Any dividend is going to require drawing more than 5%, or any dividend of any consequence. You'll be back next year building the 2023 budget, where you've got that $1.2 billion hole that's supposedly, hopefully, coming from new revenues. But again, as I was trying to explain, if you want new revenues in 2023, you really got to do something in 2021. And certainly, my opinion, others may have different, but by putting a constitutional amendment to voters in November 2022 that says no new taxes without their permission, you're really locked down if you expect that you're going to have new revenues in something in that very fiscal year. November 2022 is fiscal year 2023. So just a couple more, and this is, I guess, to emphasize the Permanent Fund Board of Trustees has at least 3 times that I see adopted resolutions in support of turning fund into a true endowment. It's going to be managed. I mean, they're managing the earnings reserve and the principal the same. It's not like one is in a bank CD and the rest are in Zoom and Tesla. It's all commingled, but in terms of the availability when you need it, and guarding against bad years, and keeping a growth fund, they've 3 times said, hey, we like the idea of a constitutional amendment for an endowment, but they do not weigh in on the dividend. And that's certainly a political question that's been around now for several years. If you amend the Constitution to truly make the permanent fund an endowment and drop this line between earnings and principal, do you put the dividend in the Constitution? And that's a question I'm sure is on many of your minds. But again, getting back to this notion, if you limit your draw to 5% a year, the fund is confident they will earn more than that over the time. And if you look at Permanent Fund Corporation projections, they will tell you, based on their assumptions, their earnings forecast, that if you limit your draws to 5% a year, you will have $80 billion in the fund at the end of fiscal year 2030. It's a pretty healthy growth between now and then. And, of course, the more money in the fund, the more money you're able to take out every year. So just the last slide here on permanent fund growth. Again, as I said, they project right now $80 billion at the end of fiscal year 30, assuming that they earn the 6 3/4, assuming the annual draw is 5. One thing to keep in mind, though, if based on those assumptions, they're saying your 5% market value draw in FY30 would be $3.66 billion. That's $600 million more than this year. Substantial benefit by letting the fund grow. If you take out an additional $3.2 billion this calendar year, FY21-22, to pay the $5,000 extra, or larger dividends, I should say, extra. One's extra in spring, the others are larger in the fall. If you take out that much money this year and then plug that in to the permanent fund projections, come 2030, you won't have $3.66 billion in your 5% draw. You'll have a couple $100 million less, because there would be 9 years that you did not collect earnings on that $3.2 billion you drew out. So there's a consequence. Certainly, many Alaskans need financial help in the state's economy. economy could use some help, but everything you take out now is going to reduce your annual draw going ahead. And I guess you can't forget about oil, right? Remember, and this is no offense to anyone out there, we're not really an oil state anymore when you think about state revenues. It's federal government, it's investment, earnings, permanent fund is $3 billion plus on the 5%. So you compare that $3 billion in the state revenue forecast for FY22 after the $3+ billion in the 5% permanent fund draw. Oil revenues come in at $800 million. Everything else, all other taxes, fees, general fund dollars, and I'm talking the unrestricted general fund here, less than $400 million. And that's not a condemnation of oil. It's just a reality that we are becoming an oil or an investment state. And I think the ANWR bids kind of show us what's happening going ahead. The industry they're not that interested in high cost, high risk investment like maybe they would have been 50 years ago at Prudhoe Bay. So the fall 2020 revenue forecast book projects oil at $48 for fiscal 22. Yesterday it closed about $6 higher than that. If oil could average North Slope oil, because there's different pricing out there, if North Slope oil for the next fiscal year average $60 instead of $48, you're going to find yourself $250, $260, $270 million in additional revenue for the general fund over and above the fall forecast, which, looking at the numbers, if you had a status quo budget, that extra revenue from $60 oil would sort of cover your budget, but still doesn't really leave you anything for a dividend. So I guess in closing, and I think we are still, oil is a huge part of the economy, and at $800 million for the general fund next year is a big part of the budget, but dreams of 90-pound Kenite Kings, $90 oil, they're dreams. And I think we've got to deal with the numbers before us. There's a lot of people who aren't even convinced $55 oil will hold in 2021, 2022. You're just getting into a lot of speculation there. So we have to deal with what we've got before us. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I want to keep it short and happy to take questions, or if you want to take questions at the end, whatever you prefer, I will stay on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Persily. We'll go ahead and take questions, and thanks for kind of taking this high-level look at everything to kind of, really distill the main questions I think that are before us. And so with that, we do have two people in the queue for questions: Representative Johnston and then Representative LeBon. Representative Johnston.
Thank you. Through the chair, can you hear me?
We can hear you great.
I can hear you.
Okay, great. And thank you, Mr. Persily, for your presentation. I have two questions. One, Mr. Persily, I know you did a contract with AML as far as sales tax and internet sales. Did you do any modeling at all as far as statewide sales tax and what that could bring in? I realize you were doing that sort of at the peak of our tourism boom.
Right. Through the chair, Representative Johnson, yes, I did have a contract with the Alaskan Municipal League last year to help them as they set up their online sales tax administration and collection program. I didn't do any modeling for them on a statewide tax, but I have done projections, estimates, modeling, conjecture for the past 20 years for the Department of Revenue, and when I was with the municipality of Anchorage and working as a legislative aide. And I guess as you think about a state sales tax, for every 1%, you can come up with estimates from $100 million to $200 million statewide per 1%. The question really comes down to what exemptions, if any, and what caps. For example, on the Kenai Peninsula, the borough has a 3% tax, but it stops at $500. You can buy a $50,000 truck, and you're only going to pay sales tax on the first $500. So, and for example, North Dakota, if you buy a $50,000 truck, you pay the state sales tax on the entire $50,000. That decision, whether or not you have a cap, makes a huge difference in collections, as does what you tax. Not just T-shirts and restaurant meals, but how literal do you want to be that the user of the good pays the sales tax? For example, I'm buying a book at Barnes & Noble. I'm the user of it. I pay sales tax. If an oil company is buying drilling pipe to use, they are the ultimate user of that. Should they be subject to sales tax on that drilling pipe? Currently, in municipalities, they say, that's manufacturing. We're not going to tax that. But if you really want to spread out that sales tax base, best way to do it is to really pull back on your exemptions and have a lower rate but a broader base, and then you can collect more money.
Or even through the chair, thinking of a value-added tax, low and broad and no exemption. My second question, if it's all right, Mr. Chair,
Go ahead,
is I too have been looking at that 10-year fiscal plan in 2023 and the other revenues and the 50-50 split. And my concern is the earnings reserve account. I do remember when we barely squeaked out a dividend in 2008 because of the market drop. But this is not even a market drop. We would be taking most of the earnings reserve account, but your look back is a 5-year look back on your 5%. So how do you have any thoughts how that what would happen?
Well, through the chair, Representative, it's a gamble, and I don't mean it to condemn gambling, but the more money you take out of the earnings reserve, as long as you have that do not cross line into the principal, you run the risk. I think clearly this week reinforced for everyone in this country, we don't know which direction this place is going. The market was up yesterday. It was down a little bit today. Will the new administration, new Congress be friendly to industry, and will investments go up, or will this next wave of, or this current wave of COVID, where people in Los Angeles, 1 in 5 are testing positive, will that lock down the economy so much that the market will head back down? It's, as the permanent fund trustees say, you draw down too much in the earnings reserve, you take the risk. As you pointed out, it wasn't that long ago. It was really tight before the end of the fiscal year whether the state knew it had enough money to cover the dividend checks.
And again, just sorry, but through the chair, we need to have a vote of the people to go into principle. Is that correct? Go into corporate.
Correct. Through the chair, Representative, yes. To change, right now in the Constitution it says there's principal you can't touch, and there's earnings that just go into the general fund. They're just like motor fuel taxes. They're just general fund money. To eliminate that line and put a constitutional direction around the entire permanent fund as an endowment would take a vote of the public. So 2/3 in the House and Senate, and then a vote in the general election, next one, November 2022.
If I could just have a minute, one other concern I have, just looking forward, is I understood that currently the money that is out, that's been printed out in the world, the dollars, 35% of it has been printed since March, which means that we have a very liquid, our dollar, we're not quite sure where our dollar is going to land after all of this and what inflation we're going to be looking at. And I just hope everybody keeps that in mind, what our dollar is going to be worth just in the next year or two. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Johnston. I have two people in the queue here, Representative LeBon, Representative Wool, but I would like to just take a moment. If anybody else has any questions, I can put you in the queue. Are there any other questions from folks, and we'll add you to the list here?
Mr. Chairman, this is Representative Ortiz. I have a question.
Okay, we'll add you to the list. And is there anybody else who would like to be added? Okay, with that, Representative LeBon, then Wool, and then Ortiz. Representative LeBon.
Yes,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Larry, for joining us today. On the theme of taxes, to follow up with Representative Johnston's questions, do you have an opinion regarding the revenue level that could be raised through a income tax? And then related to the question of a state income tax, the typical model would be a percentage of the federal income tax. What percentage would that need to be to raise a meaningful amount of money for the state, given how many Alaskans actually pay a federal income tax? So that would be my question. Thank you.
Through the chair, Representative LeBon, you're right. In many ways, the easiest way to do an income tax, a state income tax, would be pay us X percent of what you pay the feds. The simplistic, easy to calculate. The drawback certainly is, well, I shouldn't say drawback, that you then give up some tax setting policy to the federal government, because whatever they do, you're in effect going to adopt, because you're just getting a percentage of what I owe the federal government. So there's certainly a trade-off in that. And you're right, on the federal level, between earned income tax credits and other pieces of the federal tax structure, I think last number I saw, 40% of American households do not pay an income tax. They certainly pay Social Security and they may pay withholding, but at the end of the day, they are not paying a federal income tax. So I guess I've often thought of an income tax in Alaska not just as a financial and economic problem, but as a political problem. There are certainly, through the 25 years I've worked this issue with the legislature, there are many lawmakers who say, I don't like an income tax because a lot of people won't pay anything. Well, you can deal with that with a minimum. You can say percentage of feds and a minimum. There are ways to deal with that. In terms of my opinion as to how much Alaskans can afford, I think personally $1.2 billion, getting it all from income tax, would have economic consequences. That's really a heavy lift to go from 0 to 1.2. So I guess if I were a budget writer, I'd say, well, and I think even myself, the one that was up before the House, I think this was 2 or 3 years ago, that was close to $700 million a year. I think this is something we're going to have to ease into in Alaska. So maybe look for 300, 400, 500 million income tax or sales, whichever it is, and start looking at other revenue sources and maybe ramping down. As I said earlier, I think we're going to have to. I think the state's going to have to overdraw the 5% to balance the books and pay any kind of dividends. So maybe as other revenue sources, income or sales, gets implemented, you're still going to have to take a little more than the 5%, but maybe just a little more, not a wholesale amount more. Last question, I think, was what percentage of federal taxes would you need to raise X hundred million? And I don't remember that number, but I will try to find it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative LeBon. Next, we've got Representative Wool.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Larry, for your presentation today. I hope you can hear me coming through my wireless microphone. One quick comment on the previous question, if I may. The other option besides what you pay in federal taxes is perhaps use a line off the income tax form, like your adjusted gross income instead of actual tax paid. So that way, if you have a bunch of deductions, they wouldn't go against your state tax. But that wasn't my question initially. You said that if we took out, if we overdrew the fund this year by $3 billion or so, in 2030 we would reduce the 5% draw by $200 million. So it only follows that every year between now and 2030, the draw would be less, And I assume it would be more of a reduction early, and then over time that reduction would decrease. So do you have any idea what the cumulative reduction in draw would be between now and 2030? If 2030 it's less by 200 million, what's it less by in 2022, 23, et cetera? Did you do any calculations on those numbers?
Through the chairman, Representative, no, I just looked ahead, but actually it would be the opposite. In that, in the early years, it would be a smaller hit to your annual draw, and as the years accumulate, where you have less money, you're earning investment on $3 billion less in 1 year, and then the next year you still got the $3 billion less, and now you got 2 years of accumulated reduced earnings because you own fewer stocks or something. So I went out to 2030 just to see how that would compare, and I did not do the annual, but it would start as a smaller number, again also because your percent of market value is based on a 5-year average. So the first year you'd only have that reduced balance the first year, but then it would grow over time.
Well, thanks for clarifying that. Thanks. I made a wrong assumption there, but so over time, the reduction would increase, especially if it's spread out over 5 years. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Next up, we have Representative Ortiz, and but I'd like to also check again. Anybody else would like to be added to the queue? Hearing none, Representative Ortiz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Larry, Mr. Persily, for being here today and for your presentation. My question goes back to slide 4, which is titled Longer-Term Solutions. And, you know, my understanding, of course, is that the governor is proposing an annual reduction in the budget in the years to come at a 10% clip, which is actually slide 5. I'm sorry, not slide 4. 10% per year, or approximately $450 million in budget reductions for FY 22, 23, and 24. You know, that's just kind of like a flat, objective number, 450 per year. But is it safe to say that if, in fact, we were going to achieve those goals of reducing the budget $450 million a year, that the vast majority of that would have to come out of the education fund, because in essence it's my understanding that with all the cuts that we've done in past years, it's education and health and human services that are really left over to areas where we could find significant cuts or significant savings. So is that a safe assumption that if we were going to go down that road, that it would pretty much have to be at the expense of education funding? I'll just leave it at that.
Sure. And through the chair, Representative Ortiz, and that's, I guess, let me first correct a poorly designed slide. It's not $450 million a year. The proposed reductions in the state budget in total come to $450 million by the time you get to FY 24.
Okay.
So
that's okay. That seems more
rather, so it's just, and that's about 10% of the current general fund budget that we're operating under. So yeah, it's a cumulative. But right to answer your question, Representative, as we all know, when we look at the budget, having gone through this for years, and you say, I need to cut 300, 400, 500 million. There's savings and there's little things here, but when you're talking about those big numbers, as we know, the biggest spending are K-12, Medicaid, and dividends. And you'd be pretty hard-pressed, as anyone who's worked on the budget over the years, to come up with $450 million in cuts over 3 years. That doesn't affect the big items substantially.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Hearing no questions, I want to thank you very much, Mr. Persily, for kind of starting this conversation. And so with that, we will move over to our next presentation, which is Alexei Painter, he's the director of the Legislative Finance Division. And Mr. Painter, if you could put yourself on the record, he'll be doing a little more of a detailed analysis of the governor's budget. I do want to just emphasize that this will also kind of be a little more of a high level. They're still in the process of doing their deep dive, but we did want to be able to allow legislators to maybe ask Leg Finance questions that they can go back, and some of them they may be able to answer today, and some they may need to come back to us. But we thought this would give them ample time to be able to do some research and come back to us later. So with that, Mr. Painter.
For the record, Alexei Painter, and I'm the Legislative Fiscal Analyst. And Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to take questions sort of as we get through the items in the outline, if that would help to cut down.
Okay, we'll do that.
So we're going to talk first about the bigger picture of Alaska's structural budget deficit, and then we're going to talk about Legislative Finance Division's budget baselines heading into FY22, what the governor's proposal is for FY22, as well as the FY21 supplemental, and then talk about the governor's 10-year plan. So, an overall note of caution: the numbers in this presentation are drafts and may change before session. Our overview of the governor's budget is statutorily due on the first day of session, and so we are still finalizing the numbers that go into that. And our understanding of some items in the governor's budget may shift. We send a lot of questions to agencies over the holidays, and for understandable reasons, we tend to get the answers back around now. So if you ask specifics, I may defer until we can see some of those responses. So starting on Alaska's structural budget deficit, it's not a blip that we have a deficit now. FY21 is actually the 9th straight year of budget deficits for the state of Alaska. That actually began in FY13 when we had $100 a barrel oil, so this is not just a function of oil prices. However, we are in a very low period of oil revenue. In fact, the projection in FY22 is even lower than 21. It's projected to be the lowest amount of oil revenue the state has brought in since fiscal year 78 in nominal terms, so that's not adjusted for inflation. If you adjust for inflation, it's the least amount of petroleum revenue we've received since before the pipeline's construction began in FY75. So we're kind of at a historical point where oil is can no longer be the foundation of our budget based on that decline in revenue. However, we have reduced the budget substantially over the past decade. Our largest budget was in FY13 at $7.8 billion of unrestricted general funds. In FY21, that was down to $4.5 billion. That's a 43% decrease. However, 9 straight years of deficits have still had their toll in our reserves. Our reserve balances have dropped from about over $16 billion in FY13 to about $900 million at the end of FY21. So going on to slide 5, this shows unrestricted general fund revenue, excluding anything from the permanent funds, so just our kind of traditional revenue over the past decade. So our revenue peaked actually in FY12. Petroleum revenue was nearly $9 billion and declined thereafter. You can see that it declined down into FY16 and 17 and started to increase again in FY18 and 19, and then dropped again with the COVID-19 pandemic starting in FY20. And just to give an idea of kind of the scale, we had deficits in FY18 and 19 based on petroleum revenue that was over twice what we're expecting in the current year. So even a recovery in oil prices would not bring us to a structurally balanced budget at this point. As I said earlier, slide 6 shows our budget over the past decade. As I said earlier, the budget has been decreased. So our peak budget was actually FY13. at over $8 billion of unrestricted general fund. That was also our largest capital budget at about $2 billion of unrestricted general funds. Our largest operating budget was the following year, FY14. The capital budget was reduced then due to the budget deficit at the time. However, statewide items were still very high, and the agency operations were still high. FY15 is our high year for agency operations, but there was a reduction in statewide items due to a refinancing of the retirement system in that year. We began budget reductions to the operating budget, the agency operations, the following year, FY16, and you can see that those were reduced in FY16 and 17 and have basically stayed flat since FY17, with a little upward pressure in 19 and 20 that was reversed in FY21 and 22. So combining those two pictures on slide 7, you can see the last decade of revenue and expenditures. The bars show the budgets for the years. The area in the background is revenue. So the last year we had a budget, a balanced budget was FY12. We actually had a budget surplus that year and transferred money to our savings accounts. The deficits began in FY13, and you can see that as revenue declined more and more, the deficits peaked in FY15. Adopting the POMV draw beginning in FY19 did substantially reduce our budget deficits. They had been over $2 billion a year before then, and FY19 it dropped down to just a few $100 million. However, again, that was still paying less than the statutory dividend. The governor's budget this year that pays a statutory dividend brings us back into the $2 billion range for a deficit. This graph on slide 8 shows our budget reserve balances over this period. This constitutional budget reserve and statutory budget reserve. And you can see these years of deficits certainly had their toll. From a peak of $16 billion, we spent down our reserves. The SBR is completely spent down. Constitutional budget reserve, we project to have about $900 million at the end of FY21. The governor's budget doesn't really draw much from there, so it'll still be around $900 million at the end of FY22. Those of you who listened to our presentation in October, I had said at the time that the constitutional budget reserve was likely to be larger than the $600 million that we projected as we left session last year, and indeed we've increased our projection to $900 million. That is a pretty rough number at this point. We have not yet received the comprehensive annual financial report of the state, or the CAFR, that is currently being audited by legislative audit, and as they make adjustments there, we may get a different understanding. So this is an estimate that legislative finance and Office of Management and Budget have agreed on for now, but again, it's still a preliminary number. Slide 9, there's actually an error in this slide on where it says the overall UGF reduction. That actually was to the FY21 authorized budget. The management plan includes some carry forward, so that number should be the overall UGF reduction to agency operations is $515 million, or 11%, not 625 and 13.8%. But the idea with this slide is to show that while we've reduced the budget substantially over the past several years since the peak of agency operations spending in FY15, those reductions have not been felt equally across state agencies. Our public protection agencies, which we're defining as the departments of corrections, public safety, law, and the judiciary, have actually seen an increased budget. They're 6% above where they were in FY15. But generally, the trend is downward for other agencies. The Department of Education has been cut slightly. Most of that money goes out to school districts and the K-12 formula. That's down about 2%, and that's mostly due to one-time money outside the formula that districts got in FY15 and did not receive in FY21. So that has been relatively flat over this period. Health and social services is down 6%. However, this probably understates the true reduction to health and social services because in FY21 we had about $95 million of one-time money for COVID-19 relief, And so that inflates their budget a bit. So really the true reduction to health and social services is larger than this, but just doing a straight line comparison, you get 6%. All other agencies, so our other 12 agencies from the Department of Administration, to the legislature, governor's office, commerce, etc., those agencies are down 441 million, over a third. So while these large formula-driven agencies and our public protection agencies have seen relatively small reductions to their budgets, those other agencies that manage natural resources and other functions of the state have seen much larger general fund reductions, more like a third of their budgets. So I think sometimes when we talk about the budget reduction, it's just one number. It kind of obscures that for some agencies, this has been a very, very major cutting process. For others, it's been a smaller trimming, but not necessarily the reductions that some of those agencies have seen. So I can stop for questions now if you want, or I can keep going.
Does anyone have any questions? Hearing none. Mr. Painter?
So moving on. So the Legislative Finance Division has adopted or developed budget baselines as a point of comparison for the governor's budget. Rather than just view the governor's budget in isolation, we are sort of trying to have a baseline so we can see what the governor did more clearly. We have two different baselines. One is current policy, the other is current law. And so the difference between those two is that in current policy, we're assuming that statutes we underfunded or overfunded. I don't think we overfunded any statutes, but any statutes we underfunded in FY21, we're assuming that underfunding continues into FY22. The current law baseline assumes that regardless of how we treated those items in FY21, we would go back to the statute in FY22. For agency operations, both of those baselines use what we call the adjusted base, which removes one-time items from agency budgets and adds in automatic changes like salary adjustments. It's actually slightly modified from the adjusted base for our baseline to incorporate changes to the K-12 formula due to projected student count changes. We don't think it's fair to either blame or credit the governor for just a change in projection that is really outside of his control, so we built that into our baseline. In terms of statewide items, we have a table on the next page, so I'm just going to kind of skip to that, but the biggest difference is the permanent fund dividend. The current policy assumes that once again we would pay a dividend costing $680 million, that's about $1,000 a person. And the current law assumption is that we would pay a statutory dividend, which is about $2 billion, paying a bit over $3,000 a person. So this next slide compares the statewide items between those two baselines. The difference in debt service is due to the municipal project debt that the governor vetoed in FY21. That's about $2.4 million. In school debt reimbursement, the governor vetoed all funding for that in FY21. So the current policy assumption is that would be still zero. The current law assumption is $54.2 million of UGF plus money from other fund sources. State retirement, they're the same because that was fully funded in FY21. The REAA fund, which provides funding for school construction, major maintenance, and rural schools. That capitalization was vetoed in fiscal year 21, so again, that's a difference. Community assistance, the governor vetoed all UGF for that in FY 21, so our current policy assumption would be no UGF. In FY 22, or in the current policy would be zero. In current law, we would assume that the UGF portion, in order to do the statutory $30 million deposit, would be $17.6 million. There would also be funding from the PCE fund based on that statute. The final difference is the oil and gas tax credits. Those were not funded in fiscal year 21 by the legislature, and the statutory formula calls for $60 million in FY22, so in the current law assumption, we put that in there. So altogether, it's about just shy of 180 million or 170 million dollars of differences between the two assumptions in statewide items. Moving on to the comparison of the full picture, you can see the agency operations about 3.9 billion in both statewide items. There's the two numbers we saw. We assume that a baseline capital budget is about 150 million based on the last 6 years or so. That is probably not enough to fully address our deferred maintenance needs or anything like that, but that's kind of our recent baseline. And then again, the dividend we've talked about. What it adds up to is that under the current policy scenario, we'd be looking at about a $900 million budget deficit in FY22. In the current law scenario, it'd be about 2.4 billion. Again, mainly due to the difference in the permanent fund dividend. So, moving on to slide 13, comparing the governor's budget to those baselines. So, the governor's agency operations are $77.4 million below our baseline, and we'll get into those reductions in a couple of slides. The statewide items are somewhere between the two. They're about 30 million higher than the current policy, but $139 million below current law, as the governor is not fully funding several of those items. His capital budget is $58.3 million, significantly below. That's mostly due to the use of one-time AHFC bonding for statewide match. That's about $101 million. So if you counted that match as UGF, his capital budget would actually be about $160 million, so pretty close to the baseline, a little higher. He puts in the statutory dividend, and altogether the governor's budget deficit ends up being about $2.1 billion before fund transfers. So again, somewhere between current policy and current law. And overall, compared to the current law scenario, the governor's down about $300 million. So there are some significant reductions, which we'll get into as we go along here. So some of the highlights, we've already, Mr. Persily talked about some of the supplemental dividends, $1.2 billion from the ERA and FY21 for the supplemental dividend there. The ERA draw in FY22, there's the regular POMV draw plus another $2 billion for the dividend. We would consider that a deficit draw because it's beyond the statutory amount. His budget submission also includes a fast-track supplemental budget. A lot of the items in that are items that were not funded in the capital budget this last session. As most of you probably remember, being on the committee last year, we did not pass a standalone capital budget. Portions of the typical capital budget were put into the operating budget, but there were substantial omissions because I think the intention was that we would return to session at some point. Many of those items found their way into the fast-track supplemental budget. Altogether, the FY22 budget has a small deficit from the CBR after the ERA draws. So even with that additional $2 billion, there is still about a $38 million deficit from the CBR. So getting into the agency operations reductions, which again total $77.4 million. The largest one is to Medicaid. The governor's budget reduces that by $35 million. However, the governor includes backstop language where projected lapsing Medicaid funds from FY21 are reappropriated to FY22, and that's estimated to be $35 million. The result of that is essentially that Medicaid would be funded at the same level as it was in the current fiscal year. That projected lapse is due to the higher the FMAP, the reimbursement rate from the federal government that was in the CARES Act. So there's not really a reduction to Medicaid. This is more I think it's the governor's ambition for where they'd like to be in FY23. So despite it looking like a reduction, it's not really a reduction in service. It's just a reduction in the funding level. And one thing to note about that as we get into the 10-year plan, the governor is calling for further agency operations reductions in 23 and 24. Medicaid, they're already setting in the governor's budget at the level they hope to achieve in FY23. So likely that would not be a source of further reductions to meet those goals in FY23. Next largest reduction is to the University of Alaska. There's a $20 million reduction. That's the third year of the governor's compact agreement. That was $70 million over 3 years. The Department of Transportation is down, but most of that is due to one-time use of CARES Act money. The DOT received substantial amount of CARES Act money for the airports, and are able to use that in place of general fund dollars. So this $14 million fund change is not going to be something that can be sustained. That will probably have to be reversed in FY23. So while it does make the budget look a bit smaller this year, as we're getting into this plan of further reductions, you have to make up that amount again next year. There's also a reduction to the Alaska Marine Highway System of $3.6 million. That brings the AMHS budget down to match the governor's original FY21 proposal, which was a little bit lower than what his post-veto amount was. The other major reduction is to Public Assistance Administration. It's reduced by $3.4 million of UGF and over 100 positions, and that's due to some substantial technology changes that they've realized they can do because of the pandemic and workflow changes. That's about a quarter of their workforce that they're reducing. The K-12 formula is fully funded in the governor's budget. As I mentioned earlier, we factored in those changes to our baseline, so we don't give the governor credit or blame depending where you stand in education funding for that change. There is a projected student count reduction in next year below where it had been when we set the FY21 budget. That projection is very sensitive to changes in how schools will operate. There were massive differences this year due to the pandemic, and districts were kind of all over the map in how they projected things to change in FY22. So it's difficult to really know whether that projected reduction in student count will materialize or not. I would guess that'll really have a lot to do with how the pandemic proceeds over the next year. The other agency changes net to about a $1.7 million reduction. So there are some small increases and corrections in a couple other places, and then there's some smaller reductions in many other agencies, but they net to a pretty flat budget. Statewide items in the governor's budget total $464.1 million. The governor is proposing to fund school debt reimbursement and the REAA fund capitalization at 50% of the statutory level. That's where his vetoes landed in FY20. In FY21, he vetoed all funding for both of those two items. The Community Assistance Fund, he is funding with only the PCE funds that are calculated to be available to that. He's not adding the additional UGF that's allowable. The result of that is that this fund, as you may recall, pays out based on 1/3 of the fund balance. So this leads to about $19.5 million being paid out to communities in fiscal year 23 if we accept the governor's budget. That's almost exactly the amount needed to pay the community base payments. Those payments go out first for the bases, and then anything additional goes in per capita payments that go out according to population. This level essentially doesn't have enough funding for per capita payments, so communities would just receive that base. So the biggest impact to that would be large urban centers of not funding that at the statutory level. The governor does fully fund oil and gas tax credits at the statutory $60 million level. However, he does not use unrestricted general funds. He uses ADA receipts. That's an other fund code. Legislative Finance Division would kind of consider that to be a bit of a bit of a trick to reduce the budget. If the legislature feels that ADA is overcapitalized, there are a number of things we could do to reduce the amount of money in their funds or to increase their dividend they pay us. Having ADA directly pay for statewide items that have nothing to do with ADA's operations makes the budget look smaller, but is not really consistent with transparent budgeting. So if the legislature does feel that ADA has an extra $60 million, the transparent thing to do would be to transfer $60 million from ADA's reserves into the CBR and fund this with UGF. So while the governor's number again is $464 million, 60 million of that, there's 60 million on top that would really be necessary to truly represent the size of his budget. The governor also has a PERS bill, Public Employee Retirement System. That's not included in the totals, but it's in his fiscal summary. That is estimated to save about $43 million of UGF altogether. That bill involves increasing the statutory cap, or eliminating the statutory cap that the state as a PERS employer pays. It would not impact non-state entities. It would only be the state of Alaska. And then that amount would then instead be paid for with other fund sources, particularly federal funds, that allow us to fund the amount necessary to pay those full costs. The $43 million an estimate. There's going to have to be some analysis by the executive branch to figure out exactly how much of those non-UGF fund sources would be realizable and how much wouldn't. When that bill comes before the legislature, you can analyze it at that point. We'll need fiscal notes to truly understand it, though. So getting into the governor's capital budget, again, it's $58.5 million of UGF, but that's bolstered by $101.6 million of HFC bonding. So really, it's more like a $160 million capital budget, but they're taking advantage of the low interest rate environment to propose bonding that would essentially be paid for out of a reduction to the future AHFC dividend. That's a UGF revenue source. So instead of being paid for with debt service we pay, AHFC would pay the debt service and then lower their dividend that they paid to the state. So we'd see these payments show up as essentially just reduced UGF revenue. The governor also plans a general obligation bond proposal. However, no legislation has been proposed at this point, and we do not have a list of projects. There's obviously no shortage of projects that they could put in there. The list of school construction and major maintenance projects combined for over $400 million, for example. But we don't have legislation. We don't know the cost of that. We're essentially just waiting on details that may come when we start session. As I mentioned earlier, the fast track supplemental includes some of the unfunded FY21 capital projects. Some others are moved to the FY22 budget. A few others were funded through the RPL process last year. And then some of them actually were funded with other means that didn't go through the budget. So most of those capital projects that we didn't fund last year got picked up in one of those three places, but we'll have a full analysis of that in our overview of the governor's budget if you're curious about the details of what happened with all these projects. So putting it all together, here's a short fiscal summary of the governor's budget, not as short as I would like because there's kind of a lot of complicating factors this year, but essentially what it shows here is all these factors I've gone through. Where it ends in the end of the day is that in FY21 with the governor's budget, there would be about a $2.1 billion budget deficit. We've already authorized constitutional budget reserve draws to pay for some of that. He proposes to pay for the rest by paying for that supplemental PFD directly out of the ERA beyond the statutory draw level. In FY22, there'd be a slightly smaller deficit, but still about $2.1 billion. Most of that would be paid for with a draw from the earnings reserve account for the that goes directly to the dividend fund, and then the rest would be picked up from the constitutional budget reserve. So altogether, a $2.1 billion deficit each year. And I can pause for questions if you'd like, or just continue.
Just so I could summarize that slide on slide 18. So for FY22, the governor's budget has a deficit with the full PT being paid of about $2 billion. And then for FY21 with the supplementals, we're looking at a supplemental PFD, which will cost an additional about $1.2 billion. And then you've got some other supplemental items, relatively small compared to the supplemental PFD. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. Yeah, the other supplementals are $39.8 million. The largest of that is actually contingency language to reappropriate money into the disaster relief fund. So there's $30 million that he's appropriating into the disaster relief fund. The rest is these, mostly these capital projects.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from anyone online?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Johnson? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you to the chair. Thank you, Alexei. Great presentation. And I'm sure you can't answer this today, but I think, would you be able to model what we would have to earn in the permanent fund to have the funds available in 2023 for the governor's budget? In other words, for the structured draw. So what, just to be clear, if the legislature passed the governor's budget and the governor's supplemental, and they're looking to do the 2023 budget, would there be enough funds in the earnings reserve account with the current earnings, or would there, what would be the percent that would be needed to make it balance?
Through the chair, yes, we can model that for you and send that to you.
Yes, he said. Yes.
And one other follow-up. And thank you for pointing out the number of budget reductions that are one-time only this year. I'm always fascinated with the unfunded liability of our pension funds and how we pay it, and I really appreciate the governor's idea for savings. Could we consider that actually savings in the budget? When I think of the health and social service budget, most positions are paid some 50% federal, 50% state, 80% federal, 20% state. So the federal funds would be used to pay for those positions as they affect the unfunded liability. So in essence, it could be considered a reduction in the budget. Would that be accurate?
Through the chair, Representative Johnson, it would be a shift of fund sources. So in all funds, there would be no reduction in the budget, but specifically it'd be a shift from all of our, when we pay the additional cost of retirement, we pay that all with UGF. In agencies, as you pointed out, there's matching funds, there's federal funds available, so you could shift some of that spending to those fund sources. So the fiscal notes we'd expect would show about a $95 million reduction to the statewide item of retirement payments, and then $95 million increase in agency funding, but not all of that $95 million in agency funding would be UGF. So that's where that $43 million, that's the amount of reduced UGF because of the switch to other fund sources that OMB estimates they would get. And a lot of that is those 50-50 positions in health and social services. There's some with even a more favorable percentage that could result in significant UGF reductions just by shifting who pays to the federal government.
So in follow-up,
Follow-up?
you would still have the same amount of money in the budget. Just it would be the federal funds would go not only to the operation but to helping pay off pensions.
Representative Johnson, through the chair, yes, that's correct. We wouldn't see a reduction in the total budget level, but there would be an increase in federal funds that are being used to pay for that cost.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd also like to recognize that we've been joined in the audience by Representative-elect Kaufman. Thank you for joining us. And are there any other questions? It looks like we've got, I think, 3 more slides, but taking a pause here for a moment. Any other questions before we move on?
Mr. Chairman, this is Representative Ortiz. I do have a quick question.
Representative Ortiz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's see if we can go back to slide 9. And it's entitled "Alaska Structural Budget Deficit Continued," and it's that slide that kind of shows where the different reductions have been made, and at the top of it, there's the all other agencies, and it points out that there's been a 35.6% reduction in funding for all other agencies outside of Health and Human Services and Education and Public Protection. So, again, that's a number or it's a percentage. Is it ever a part of the Ledge Finance's duties to do some sort of assessment as to the effective potential loss in effectiveness of these agencies to carry out their constitutional requirements when these reductions are made? In other words, is there ever an attempt to measure the impact of the reductions that have been made? Or let's look maybe to a more favorable future. If we get more funding for some of these other agencies 10 years down the road, is there ever a measurement to say how effective was that increase in funding? Did it bring about a better ability for the agency to do their function or do their constitutional duty? My question is, does Ledge Finance ever do any assessment as to the impact of these reductions or increases?
Representative Ortiz, through the chair. There are a series of missions and measures that are reported as part of the governor's budget submission that are required by statute, where each component within the budget reports on their success relative to the metrics that they've set. So you can look and compare those performance metrics from before the reductions to now and see how those compare. Those are designed to do that. They haven't gotten a lot of attention from the legislature in recent years, but that missions and measures process in statute is designed to provide that information. If you go to the Office of Management and Budget's website and look through their detailed budget books that they have there, or they're available, I think those books are available for members as well. You can see those missions and measures for each component and do that analysis. We do not perform any further analysis beyond just pointing to those missions and measures that are there in the governor's budget.
Okay, thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Representative Ortiz. We do have a little bit of scratching on the in the background, and it might be our sound system, but just in case, if folks could just mute their phones. Well, first of all, I've got Representative Wool in the queue, but is there anyone else who would like to be added to the queue?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Representative LeBon, please.
Great, we'll add you on here. Anybody else? Hearing none, Representative Wool.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Alexei, for your presentation. I have a couple of questions. One, I'm sort of stating the obvious, but page 12 in the presentation, can I deduce that the pre-transfer deficit of $886 million, if the PFD was zero, we basically have a deficit of $200 million. For a while, that number was 300. Am I correct in assuming that with a zero PFD, our budget deficit is around $200 million?
Representative Wolf, through the chair, with the other current policy assumptions, yes. So assuming that we're also, not funding other statewide items, yes, it'd be about a $200 million deficit.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to be able to have that talking point. The other question, let's see, I have 2 more questions. One was regarding the reduction that's been experienced at public assistance, 101 positions, reducing by $3.4 million. My calculation, that's $34,000 per position. If that is correct, does that mean there must be more reduction from 100 positions than that? So there's, obviously, that's not just a direct correlation, I would think. And are there other areas that have been reduced by that many positions due to the pandemic and people working remotely that you know of? And I guess my first question is $3.4 million for 100 positions. You're not making that direct correlation, right?
Representative Wolf, through the chair, the $3.4 million is just the UGF reduction. There's also a reduction in federal funding. So it's really a reduction of about twice that in total in all funds. And to your second question about if there's other reductions that large, that's really, we highlighted it because that's by far the largest reduction of positions or of kind of responsibilities, although this is just shifting the service delivery that we see in the budget. There's some smaller efforts, closing DMV offices and so forth that, do reduce some positions and a few and smaller savings, but this is by far the largest reduction we see to the scope. I think the next largest would probably be in the Department of Revenue and Child Support Division. There's a substantial reduction there due to a replatforming project. But most of that is to contractual services, not to positions.
Okay, so public assistance and child support are the ones in the reduction in staff and reduction. And on page 18, the very bottom left line, deficit from CBR, $896 million. And your graph at the beginning had a CBR balance in it. It wasn't detailed enough to see what the balance was, and maybe you mentioned it and I forgot. So, am I correct that the deficit from CBR, that's 896 taken out of the CBR in 21? Is there even that much in the CBR?
Representative Wolf, through the chair, yes, the $900 million we project to be remaining in the CBR at the end of FY21 is after that deficit draw. Actually, that's already been pulled out because of the way the legislature funded the budget, where a quarter of the budget directly came from the CBR. That was drawn at the very beginning of the year, so that is factored into our projections.
Okay, so the balance we saw already included that withdrawal of $896 million.
Representative Wolf, through the chair, yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, Representative LeBon.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Painter, for joining us today. And if I can go back to slide 16, I want to talk a little bit about ADA and the receipts used to fund the oil and gas tax credits. In my opinion, it is not possible for ADA to be overcapitalized, and I think you suggested likewise that if they were indeed overcapitalized, then how much are they overcapitalized, and how would you define that they're overcapitalized? ADA is the state bank, and for them to be overcapitalized is not a practical argument. Their capital level helps them originate investments on behalf of the state and to secure low interest rates on their bond raising activities. So they're not overcapitalized. But if one were to suggest that they were, is it a practical strategy to look at drawing $60 million from ADA this year, and then what about next year and the year after? Is this the new program to fund the oil and gas tax credits via ADA, or is this just a one-year event? And that would be my question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Through the chair, Representative LeBon, I'm not sure what the governor's plan is in subsequent years. Based on the 10-year plan, there does not seem to be an increase in fiscal year 23 that would suggest that they plan to pay for tax credits with UGF. So maybe it's their plan to continue doing that. I have no idea. They have not said. In terms of whether ADA's capitalized at the proper level or not, I mean that's a discussion the legislature's had 2 years ago when the governor last proposed something like this to directly draw their funds. That is a policy call of how much funding you would like them to have. One mechanism, if you generally think that they have more in reserves than they need would be to increase their dividend statute to match HFC's dividend statute. HFC has to pay about 75% of their earnings, of their net revenue, as their dividend. ADA's dividend statute calls for them to be between 25 to 50, so they retain more of their earnings. So if the legislature decided for whatever reason, hey, ADA is sitting on too much money, we want more of it, that would be one mechanism. I'd also note that the most recent credit rating I saw for ADA specifically cited the legislative appropriations from ADA receipts that were made 2 years ago as a note of caution for ADA's credit. That a concern for ADA generally, according to the credit rater, was that their funds would be used by the state to meet its expenses. So that is a concern that's been raised by the credit rater, and could result in a reduced credit rating if we did something like this. Even if we intended it as a one-time item, it may be interpreted as a signal that their credit rating should be decreased because they don't have control over the funding.
Yes, thank you. And I guess it was more of a comment than a question, but I appreciate the input. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Are there any further questions before we move on to slide 19? Hearing none, Mr. Painter.
All right. So going to the governor's 10-year plan, kind of in broad strokes, the governor's plan calls for ERA draws beyond the statutory level in FY21 and 22. However, his plan calls for a balanced budget beginning in FY23. So he achieves that through three main mechanisms. One is to change the statutory dividend formula from 50% of statutory net income to 50% of the POMV draw. That's a reduction of about $400 million per year. He does make that contingent on a vote of the public. There's agency operations reductions of another $100 million each, roughly in FY23 and 24, and then reduced growth below the level of inflation of about 1.5% after that. And that is consistent with the spending limit, the constitutional spending limit proposal that the governor has made in the past. Then the largest deficit filling item in the governor's 10-year plan is between $900 million and $1.2 billion a year in new revenue starting in fiscal year 23. He does not specify where that revenue will come from. The largest year of revenue is actually FY23, and then the amount sort of moves around as needed to ensure no budget deficits each year. So moving to slide 20, these overdraws from the ERA increase future deficits by reducing the amount of money in the permanent fund. Previous presenter talked about the specific years, but I think our rule of thumb is that we have a 5% POMV, and therefore $3.2 billion of draws means that 5% of that is a permanent reduction to or increase in the deficit. So 5% of 3.2 billion is 160 million. So future deficits would be $160 million larger in real terms, so inflation adjusted terms. Part of with the averaging over several years and the lag and then inflation, you can kind of get fuzzy what type of impact you're talking about. So we try to keep it simple and just say 5% of 3.2 billion is 160 million, and that's your inflation adjusted permanent increase to your deficit. And so the legislature has to weigh your desire for stimulus spending this year. Obviously, the economy is struggling, and the governor wants to, through higher dividends and the bonding proposal, inject capital into the economy. And that does come at a long-term cost. It comes at a cost of future revenue, meaning that essentially it'll result in the future a tax increase or reduced services. And that is a policy call for you as a legislature to make. Is this stimulus worth the long-term cost? Another note about the governor's budget is that the new revenue in fiscal year 23 would need to be authorized this year because the the revenue starts essentially July 1st, 2022. It wouldn't be practical to next session try to set up a new tax that quickly. It is actually possible to have revenue measures that would take effect that quickly, particularly with the sales tax. Municipalities across the state have sales taxes. They now have a kind of unified system to collect sales taxes from online sales, and we could possibly leverage that and get a sales tax up and running pretty quickly. But again, that would need to be something the legislature takes up this session. Because the danger is that if you agree to these overdraws without deficit filling measures, next year you're going to be in a situation where you're once again facing a large deficit. The economy is doing better because the pandemic has lifted and because of the stimulus you've done, but we still have a large deficit. Now we don't have anywhere to turn to other than, again, overdrawing the ERA. And that's kind of the scenario in which we can get to draining the ERA just like we did the CBR and SBR. So each year we delay resolving the long-term deficit, we'll dig this hole deeper. So every year we draw more from the ERA than the statute calls for, means that we'll have higher taxes or reduced services in the future. If we pull from our designated funds, same thing. If you pull from the PCE fund, we now either need to find another source to pay for PCE or that program goes away. That's going to just increase pressure on the budget if we draw from those DGF funds. So delaying just keeps digging this hole deeper and deeper. One analogy I would use is that, the governor's stimulus is sort of your dessert. You get your dessert up front. You get, this great stimulus spending that is going to be politically popular. But in the governor's plan, you only get that if you also eat your vegetables, which is the budget cuts and the new revenue. If you try to just have your dessert and not eat your vegetables, obviously that's not going to work out nearly as well. And so the governor's plan does rely on you doing both things. You as a legislature could make completely different policy choices that would still work. You could, call for lower dividends than the governor has and less revenue. You could call for deeper budget cuts. There's all sorts of tweaks you could make, but the bottom line is that every year you delay actually closing the structural deficit, it makes it more difficult to close that deficit, and the costlier it is to do so. And that's all I have, so we can go, if there's any more questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Painter. Just a quick question from me. And this is something that you can crunch the numbers later, and it's not a high priority for me, but I'm just more curious, based on the FY22 budget that's being presented here, not including the FY21 supplemental, what would the price of oil need to be to balance? And maybe it's $200 a barrel or whatever it is. I'm just curious. So with that, are there any questions from anybody online? Okay. I don't hear any questions. So with that, any final comments, Mr. Painter?
I do not. Look forward to working with you this session.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, with that, I'd like to thank also Mr. Persily for giving us this high-level overview as well. Mr. Painter, thank you for coming in. This is not something normally we do, but we wanted to get the ball rolling as soon as we could. And so, hearing no further questions, is there any other business to come before the committee? Seeing none, hearing none, we will be adjourned at 12:40 p.m. Thank you very much, everyone.
Hi, my fellow Alaskans. I'm glad that I got a whole bunch of you guys able to see the budget talks for the state and capital budget, the proposed budget. The House got an overview review from their paid-for setup. Basically, these folks were there to do nothing more than tell us that they were involved in making sure everything that they discussed to us was raising taxes, Zero meaningful cuts. They have no idea how they can make them happen. This is impossible. You're asking too much of us. We're not capable of doing these kind of things. That is basically the story that we just got to listen to today. They started out the discussion about the full PFD at the very beginning of this, and why it is unable to do that. Yes, there is enough money to be able to pay us everything that they have stolen from us, the budget, and still have made a profit this year, but they did not have any budget there available to see that actually showed what it would look like if they did just what the governor has put in his proposal for the 2021-2022 state budget. It really was a sham watching this today. It was just like, I said it during the comments in there, that this is like Groundhog Day in Juneau. We're watching the same sad song that they have sung the last 3 years. And as was mentioned there at the very end, this is not normal for them to hold this type of a session of pre-budget talks without having the legislators that are currently going to be in this next budget cycle sitting in the conversation. Several of the legislators that got to comment and ask questions, they were voted out, but they're the ones asking the questions. This is just a prelim of them setting it up to try to explain why they're not going to do what the governor has asked them to do, why they won't cut a single cent off of the budget, why they're going to continue to increase it. There was one highlight of good news. There is a $3.5 million cut from the budget, that $13 billion budget when you add it all together. A $3.5 million cut for employed people that they had working in this one division there. That's going to lose about 100 jobs, supposedly, somewhere around in there, or a little more than that. And but this virus had a silver lining. It showed them that they were not needed, that their jobs could all be done online or by a program, and they were useless to begin with. So that there is a piece of good news, silver lining there. Too bad they just don't look at all of the companies out there, that the operations within our government that are uselessly doing absolutely nothing but still receiving a paycheck. If they're not needed during this virus, for the most part, in a administrative type position, they don't need to be here anymore unless you're boots on the ground actually doing the hard labor, like emptying the trash cans or something like that. You're not an essential worker. You're not needed. You're just sitting at home twiddling your thumbs, receiving a paycheck. This is what our government should be looking at there in Juneau, our legislators, and cutting their budgets and eliminating these useless people. Take advantage of the virus. K through 12, early learning, that was brought up in there. CARES Act money, $1.3 billion budget that they had this past year. They're talking about keeping it at that $1.3 billion level. This does not include all of the CARES Act money that they have received on top of that. So they are well over the 1.3. I think they're closer to 1.6 billion dollars is what they got. Somewhere around 300 million or more was given to them from the CARES Act to reopen schools and stuff like that, which obviously they haven't been open. They haven't needed all of their staff. Their administration has realized they should, at least at this point, realize where their redundancy is. They could have took this time and reorganized, use the established homeschool programs that were already out there, and use that as their programs to be teaching our kids from. But no, they had to design their own brand new, out of the box. Here's how we teach brick and mortar learning, where we were already worse in the nation at the highest cost for doing that. And now we're going to turn that into a virtual program and expect it to be better. Of course, we saw the dismal results. Our students are doing even worse. Our kids are failing in schools right now. They're not getting the education that they need. We're hearing the cries and the screams, please bring back the brick and mortar schools, just so that they can go back to a slightly better, and we're talking by at least one rank better, school system than what they're teaching right now virtually. Yet the homeschool programs, the established ones that have been around here for quite a while now, those homeschool programs actually have excelled. Students that started out their sophomore years this year are now graduating as seniors because they're no longer held back with the rest of the class when they're completed with their work. They're just told to keep going at the pace you want to go. And it's amazing. I'm listening to freshmen that are talking about graduating as seniors next year that have entered into the homeschool programs because they're go-getters. They don't stop once they get started. They just want to keep going until it's done. Knowledge is power. It's amazing. Can you imagine a 10th grader being done with high school, starting into their college classes virtually online and having whatever direction in their life that they want to go? If not college, get into a trade school, something out there, start learning what they want to become and be. Amazing what could happen if we actually were to embrace technology and walk into the 21st century for our K through 12 and early learning school systems. The platforms are already out there. They just got to use them and use them right. Quit using these failed, we're going to make up our own version of how we're going to run school, brick and mortar system. Shake my head. Again, there was more talks about statewide taxes, an income tax. I'll throw out the income tax out there. That would be beneficial, but you can look at it when you got the working population of the state, and most of us in Alaska are not a part of the middle class or upper class. We are considered the working poor. The working poor in Alaska, and if you include the welfare numbers that are on welfare, that's 50% of Alaska. So the other 50%, you got to consider we've got the very high, over the age of seniors that are no longer working anymore. In fact, they just came out with the population increase and loss of what we've lost. We lost 4,000 more Alaskans out of the state of Alaska. They have just up and walked away, left our state, so our population is now 4,000 smaller than it was the year before. Majority of that all came from Anchorage, had the largest population drops for just where people live and moved out of. Again, the Valley was number one again, as per usual, as being for the increase of where the most people have moved into. So the Mat-Su Valley's population is increasing, and they have for the last few years in a row now been number one in the state for increasing, not losing population. Bulk of the population that we lost did happen in Anchorage too, that left state. Just so that you're aware, out of those 4,000 people, the majority of them all left out of Anchorage. They're no longer there. Nice tax base you got there, acting mayor Quinn Davison. Nice tax base. They're all moving out. The working age population has also decreased by 1% throughout the state this year. So that means, and that's not pandemic caused. That is what has happened by the people that have moved out, that are no longer working in our state. So that's a pretty dramatic drop, especially when you look at the 4% increase in our senior population of 65 and older. 4% this year it increased. So we're not increasing our working class, we're increasing the retirement class. I've been warning you all about this for quite a while now. If you watch what I put out there, once it hits the Juno time of the year for election season, you'll see that my feeds completely change. I'll be more focused on what's here in Alaska going on. A lot more live streams of gavel to gavel, making sure that the most important ones are out there so you get to watch them and be informed of what to expect. But statewide taxes, 50% of the population in Alaska is the working poor, and you want to impose a statewide tax, and then you talk about an income tax, so how much you make. Well, then you look at that 50% there again, they're completely eliminated out of the equation because they're not going to make an income that's going to have to pay a tax. But the non-working poor, the remaining 25% of the population, because you got to think 25% of the population in Alaska is 65 or older. They no longer work. So we only got up 25% of Alaska's population that's trying to pay for 100% of what they want with the state income tax. So just to give you guys a clue where the direction that they were talking. When it came to cuts, it was slap on the hand. Oh, here's the university one. The contract that the governor signed 3 years ago. That, to me, I always will consider that one a masterful stroke of genius on his part. Stopping the discussion about the University of Alaska, completely getting them taken off of the table and forcing a $75 million cut over 3 years. Could you see that happening without that negotiation at this point in time? I don't. Now they're talking about a $35 million cut to like Medicaid, and I don't see that ever panning out, because then they immediately said, but there's also language written into it that makes sure that if anything does go wrong, that the money still will be there. But we still haven't seen the one big key thing that'll happen just after the 19th, when they start discussing about the supplemental budget. The budget that gets passed on top of the budget they had from last year to cover everything they were short paying for. That one's going to come out. I'm expecting that to be anywhere between $200 million and $600 million more. Our current statewide budget for the entire state of Alaska, state and capital budget combined, UGF and DGF, hit roughly around $13.2 billion this last year. If they have another supplemental budget that was like last year, that budget's now going to be $13.7 billion that they spent here within our state. So that would be worst case scenario. Best case scenario would be 13.4. These are approximate numbers, but that is about what the total is when you add up all the UGF, DGF, every penny that our state government spends out there. That's how much they put out every single year. The only way they're going to decrease it, and that's including what they paid us for our permanent fund dividend, our reduced pivot dividend, our $600 million that they used tax revenue to pay for illegally using tax revenue when they changed that 2 years ago. Did it again last year. I'm expecting them to try to do it again this year. They did talk about how the money was to be pulled out for everything that is to be paid for our past PFDs and our current PFDs. It would be utterly following statutory law, pulling all of the money directly out of our ERA. They are going to twist that, and they are going to say that, no, we are supposed to use tax revenue to pay the PFD, and the ERA is just an appropriation for our state budget. And that has nothing to do with your guys' PFD anymore. This is how they're going to try to approach it this year, to say we don't get a permanent fund dividend. It's going to, bottom line is going to be, is no, look at what we did the last 2 years. We're going to do the same thing again this year. We set precedent. We don't care if the statutory PFD law still sits on the books. We don't care if our POMV law that we put onto the books doesn't have language in it that allows them to do this. We set precedents by just doing it, and your legislators, our legislators, voting for it. All right, I'm going to wrap this up. Watch the entire video. It is worth hearing what the prelim, never really, as far as the person at the end of the video there had to say, ever happened before, talking about the budget with legislators that were voted out. And we're all a part of the coalition to steal the PFD in the first place, have been systematically dismantling it for the last 4, 5, now we're going on 6 years. And so anyways, share this video. Alaskans need to know what's going on. That has always been my full focus, is to make sure that whatever is happening in Juneau will be out to you. I try to keep everybody updated and informed when these kind of events are going to happen, and then I will live stream them if I'm not working. So today I got a chance, was able to do it, and now I actually got to go to work. So again, like and share. Go to my website, Politadick.com. Click on the donate button. All your proceeds go right back into making sure that I can continue to keep doing this, keep upgrading the equipment, keep making it so that things like this that was only available on Alaska AKTV, it was not live streamed on Facebook anywhere else as far as I am aware, and so this is the only live stream of this entire House discussion about the proposed state and capital budget from Governor Mike Dunleavy there. And I really want to keep doing this full time, but it takes your guys' donations and your guys' support to be able to do that. So again, go to www.politadick.com, click the donate button, and all proceeds go right back into just keep on expanding what I'm doing here. You all have a great night or afternoon, and have a great day.